Senua's Saga Hellblade 2 stands as one of the most impressive games we've seen this year, and in fact, this entire generation. It's a game that pushes the limits of what Unreal Engine 5 can offer at this point in time, taking full advantage of its many features. Beautiful acting, amazing character models, stunning landscapes, and truly exceptional lighting all come together to create a moody, beautiful, atmospheric experience. And on this special episode of Digital Foundry, we've had a chance to sit down with 3 key members from the development team to talk about the game. So let's get into it. Thanks for joining us, guys. It's great to have you here. I want to start by actually going back to the beginning. When the project first got underway, obviously this was announced prior to the arrival of the new consoles. It was the first next generation game announced, and as we know now, it did end up shipping on Unreal Engine 5, utilizing many of those key features. But when you announced it, UE5 didn't yet exist publicly, and you guys didn't actually have any information on this either. Can you talk about the point where you first switched over to this new version of Unreal Engine, what your first thoughts on these new tools and technologies were, and sort of like discuss the transitional period when you moved over from UE4 to UE5?
So yeah, the initial Senua's Saga was actually UE4 for quite a while. And I remember, we all saw the tech demos for UE5 come out and we were like, really? Like, is that real? Like, are we going to be able to use that many triangles? It was a little bit of trepidation. Actually looking into it, we then started to think about how we could use that to really sort of make the vision of a really immersive cinematic experience.
So I'm trying to think when we transitioned.
It was after the Troll demo, actually.
Yeah. So probably a little known fact that the Troll demo was actually UE4.
Yeah.
And we transitioned after that, which was pretty smooth, really.
It wasn't too bad.
It wasn't that many parts of moving over to UE5 that were that alien. There was the excitement of going to Nanite and Lumen. Yeah. But it was pretty easy, I would say.
Yeah. I think as a developer, though, it's so easy to get super excited. You see all these new features and we're going to use them all. We want everything. But then you kind of come back down to reality and go, okay, we've got the GPU limits, the CPU limits, certain memory. So actually, how do we balance this stuff?
Because we weren't totally sure that we were going to use Nanite even at the beginning, or even Lumen, because of the overheads of that stuff. So
Then virtual shadow maps came in really late, but it was one of those things when we saw them on the characters, it's we really need this. This is just going to sell those performances so much better.
So one of the key features then, of course, is Nanite, and Hellblade is a game that features a lot of dense, granular geometry across its world. It's extremely detailed, but this was also true of the Unreal Engine 4 version you guys showed off prior to switching to Unreal Engine 5. And I'm curious how this impacted the art pipeline, the workflow, and generally what it was like transitioning from the more traditional static mesh design to using Nanite in your game.
Yeah, so moving to Nanite from a static mesh point of view, it's all or nothing. So it's more expensive to have a non-Nanite mesh, right? So we had to go all in. In terms of how it changed our pipeline, you remove a big chunk of that processing time kind of thing because you're effectively taking the raw data, right? Because we moved over to doing as much photogrammetry as possible as well. Well, first of all, you're removing the chunk of the pipeline where you're making stuff by hand. And then you're having to reduce it down and bake it and then get it in engine. So there's a big bit of that that's just gone. So we upfront loads of stuff by going out and capturing things on location or in the studio, etc. And then it's a case of processing that and post-processing it kind of a lot of automated ways, that we've done. And then getting it straight in, at its, highest fidelity that, we can. So it then leaves you a lot more time to do things like set dressing and lighting, composition, and all that kind of stuff. It was quite a bit of a change, really. That's kind of the biggest thing for us in environment art.
I think it's really good from a workflow perspective, cutting out the, I'm making just 100 rocks, right? Actually, you can then go, right, what will make this scene look good? How can we adjust the light to sort of really pick out the detail? And it sort of frees you up to actually be a bit more artistic and less sort of manual labor that actually isn't as enjoyable as the artistic part of it.
Which version did you end up shipping on? Because there was a point where Nanite couldn't handle things such as vegetation, foliage, and the like. Which version was that?
5.3 we shipped on. Actually, what you just said was actually a really important upgrade for us. Because we did want, moving foliage and that kind of stuff. And as you said, 5.2, 5.1 didn't have that, and we were really restricted in that sense.
Foliage was a huge bottleneck for a long time because of the expense of having a nanite mesh with non-nanite meshes for grass, etc. And then you had nanite mesh, but with masked material on it was super expensive. So we did a lot of we had some networks in Houdini where we did like a bulk conversion of assets to basically cut out geometry where the masking was. Wow. Which is a bit of a pain when you're having to kind of retrofit it in, but what you ended up with obviously works pretty well. So all the grass meshes, all of the bushes and trees and things like that, we had to kind of do a lot of post-processing on those when we moved over to the fully nanite foliage system.
It looks cool when you go into photo mode though, and like zoom right in. It's like, oh, okay, that is actually modeled, and it's nuts.
Okay, so when you switched over to using nanite, was there ever a moment when you went from making discrete, distant-based LODs to nanite that you realized after the switch that you could increase the quality of what would have been LOD 0 before, because now nanite would render it with greater efficiency? Yeah,
so like the equivalent of LOD 0 stuff, there's definitely a bump. It's probably not as high poly as you would think in a lot of instances. We got away in a lot of assets by doing a 50% reduction on the nanite meshes as well, with no visible difference in a lot of instances. Because we were still, so the big bottleneck for you on with nanite is memory. That's the new poly count, as it were. We hit, when you hit the memory too hard with too many super high poly nanite meshes, then you get an issue. So you have to kind of selectively go in there and basically start reducing polys on the nanite meshes. But in a lot of instances, you can get away with a huge amount of reduction without seeing any sort of visual fidelity drop.
So that explains what I noticed, that in photo mode, if you sort of zoom the camera in real far, you can see it kind of breaks down a little bit, but from a normal gameplay perspective, it looks really, really good, right? The detail is there. So it makes sense to sort of limit the mesh density to save on memory resources and such.
And it's interesting you say that, because like when you go into photo mode, you're breaking it in a way. And you've always got to remember, it's easy to kind of, in dev, to be always in the debug cam and you're flying around and you're putting in detail where you don't need it. And as soon as you go into the game camera, you're missing 90% of that detail because of what, for the distance that you're away from the surface.
Since you weren't using Lumen in that original Troll demo, I was curious what aspects of indirect lighting you were bringing over from Unreal Engine, what would have been 4 at that time. Was it baked lighting with light maps, or was it something else?
It was fully real-time lighting in that one, but lots of placed individual point lights, non-shadow casting lights, like just to fake the bounce.
It's also worth saying, actually, even with Lumen, we were going in and hand art directing and hand placing bounce cards and lights and stuff and that as well, to kind of supplement what you got from the real-time GI. Yeah.
Because our aesthetic, we always called internally like cinematic realism rather than realism. The way a movie set would be lit, like, we had extra lighting, as well as the bounce lighting and stuff, because it's so important for the feeling of certain scenes and sections.
Oh, so that's really interesting then. So I wonder then, when you were making that Troll demo, which is still in UE4, was the intent to essentially handle lighting across the entire game in the same way as, the more traditional method of placing a lot of very carefully hand adjusted lights throughout the scene in order to get the desired effect.
Well, I mean, it was the same for us. It was a continuation of Sacrifice. So it was exactly the same way as we lit a lot of that stuff as well. So it wasn't really, we weren't really doing anything new in that respect.
I think, once we did move to Lumen, actually it freed us up a bit more because that took care of a lot of the hard work.
You would kind of light the scene and then go back and sort of artistically adjust it rather than doing all the work first.
On Sacrifice, we were using a real-time GI add-in called Enlighten. So it's very similar to what we ended up doing with Lumen. It was a lot slower in terms of like update and things like that, but you were getting that baked real-time bounce stuff.
Right. That's cool. We'll get more into Lumen here shortly, but related to that then, I'm curious right off the bat then, if you considered using the hardware path for Lumen, because as far as I know, every version of the game, PC, console, whatever, they're limited to the software path, which still looks great, but it does have some negative ramifications, such as the areas around water, where you're using screen space reflections, there's disocclusion artifacts, etc. It's the kind of like the one visual thing that falls a little short of everything else in the game. So I'm curious how you came to the decision to only do software Lumen.
Yeah, totally agree with you. It was a learning process on how we balance kind of all the kind of performance and everything. And like on console, it just wasn't an option at this time. But we're still learning. We've made some incredible profiling tools for this project. So overnight, it would do a run of the game. We had like a self-play system where design could basically make the character go and play the game. And that would record all the data, all the memory, GPU, CPU. And then in the morning, we had a little team looking at it and we could see the spikes of certain things. So at some point, we'll probably look back into the hardware implementations of it and sort of see if there's a way we can balance that kind of cost. But we're a limited team size, right?
So along those same lines, then I'm wondering the cost on Xbox Series S, because like on Series S, you don't get the SDF style reflections. You just get SSR, and everything below is just sort of like the cube map. So is that a memory limitation or is it a GPU limitation?
That was a GPU limitation.
Okay. So it's just a GPU limitation, right?
Yeah. So yeah, that was the decision to only use the screen space ones on Series S. Tricky balance doing S and X.
Alex?
From an art design perspective, I'm curious if the game was always designed around being CinemaScope from the very first day of its development, or if that was something that came along over a period of time.
It was quite an early decision, and we knew at that time it was probably going to be a little controversial. but there was very specific reasons for choosing that format. Like, obviously there was various cinematographers and kind of movies that we were referencing and looking at, but also the nature of the Icelandic landscape itself. We actually wanted that wide format because it lent itself to showing that kind of environment much better. I think it obviously wasn't just the black bars. We modeled the lens so you have the correct barrel distortion as the correct kind of depth of field, lens flares and stuff. And I think it's those little details that people might not notice, but subconsciously, because you're so used to watching movies and TVs in that format, I think your brain fills in a lot of the gaps and you look at it and go, oh my God, this really does sort of look a lot more like a movie than some other games might do. And it's those little details, I think, that help that. But, it's a kind of bit of a bold creative risk because it is different to what people expect from a video game.
I really love the lens simulation stuff. It's one of the most unique visual elements in the game's presentation, especially with depth of field, because it actually behaves more like an actual camera lens, like a real piece of glass, which you often don't really see in video games, but it feels very authentic here.
Yeah, that was definitely a key thing for us, kind of making it behave like a real world lens.
So one tech art detail that I'm very curious about is how the running water is done in the game, the various sources of it. It's really obvious, I think, in the first level with the little pitter patter and dripping of water going down the landscape. So could you tell me how that was achieved?
So we built a tool in Houdini, actually. So it would export the mesh from the Unreal Editor, put it into Houdini, and then we generated the flow maps down it. And then we could chunk that up into kind of surface and kind of side flows. And then that was all rendered with the single layer water render pass. Initially, we had basically one giant export, and quickly we became aware it's like, oh my God, the GPU cost of this is way too big. So then had to go back into Houdini and get it to sort of spit out more chunks that would kind of be not rendered when you don't need them. But yeah, it was a Houdini based simulation. Then we had it was a mix of material and decal layer, kind of shaders to get the scrolling right. But yeah, it feels pretty nice. I think when the water looks as though it's flowing correctly, like down the rock surfaces. It's not just a single direction.
A different visual effect, actually one of my favorites in the game, was that section where you first approach that village, right? Before you meet your first comrade, right? In that section, there's this beautiful village just like enshrouded in fog and darkness. And there's these bursts of light, of flame. It's incredible. And every time it hits, both in terms of the HDR, the way it lights up the volumetric fog, it's really, really gorgeous. And it's actually a real dynamic light. So like where you're standing as the player with Senua, you actually see the light on the scenery. So I'm wondering if you can talk about what it took to actually sort of build the scene in the game, because it really is one of the best lit scenes I think I've ever seen in a game.
I mean, that's where kind of something like Lumen comes into its own. And the fact that volumetric fog can be lit by sort of individual light sources. I think we referenced like Temple of Doom, right? For that section, we wanted that kind of really dramatic thing. And there was always this idea that we wanted the audio and the VFX to sync together. Because that's always so powerful when you do that. And, it's kind of our teams love working together and sort of interconnecting those things. But yeah, being able to now light particles and volumetrics with the same lights that are lighting the environment is quite a big thing, and you can do scenes like that now, which is fantastic from an artistic creator point of view.
Actually, we should probably talk about the audio as well, because that's a huge portion of the game's presentation. The timing of the audio to the gameplay beats is really, really special. And I also want to talk about the binaural stuff. But let's start by talking about from like the workflow perspective. Like essentially, how did you work with the graphics team to ensure that scenes like this were possible in terms of synchronizing what's happening on screen to the sound that you created? So it doesn't just feel like random sound or whatever. It actually feels like a truly crafted experience, which seems really difficult to implement. So I'd love to learn how that worked.
This thing in particular is actually really complicated in audio, and the music that is happening during the battle and before the battle is all happening half in world and half crafted by us. But this means like if a drum is placed in the world and there is acoustics, the acoustic space is taken in consideration. So for this, we use a tool created by Microsoft called Project Acoustics. We basically take is really complicated tool, but it works fantastic for what we need, which is deep immersion. Like you really believe the space you are, and the sounds feel they pertain to this space. So you don't feel like no, this echo is it cannot be. It actually feels connected. So we need to create like a voxel map of all the static meshes and landscape. We need to send this to the cloud to do a lot of calculations, and that give us based on where is the emitter and where is the listener, everything that is in between, and create obstruction, occlusion, and all these sonic modifiers. So that mixed with to be effects. So when there is a drum, the fire goes. We drive fire, and the same in the battle. So it creates this sense of connection that is so actually very important for the character we are portraying, how her brain tries to connect everything. So I think the whole scene is really powerful.
Yeah, it's like you were able to put events on like particular drum beats. So if it's a light drum or a heavy drum in the level blueprint, I can then take that and go, okay, I want like huge fire burst or little quick bursts. And that was very prevalent during that combat scene at the end, like the lighting on the small drum beats. We cycled round the arena, so you got that kind of almost strobe effect. And then on big beats, it was a different light that then lit up the entire arena.
Also dynamism, because if you listen to a piece of music and the drum is always placed in the same spot at the same loudness, it gets boring. The moment you are circling around and your ear gets stimulated because, oh, now it's farther away, it's quieter, it's different, it creates a sense of movement. I think it helps that, in particular, the scene or any scene. It feels that the audio is alive.
Yeah. Part of the immersion then stems from the use of binaural audio. And that's something I've been fascinated with for decades. You know, with the whole head mic, with the microphones inserted in the ear canal. Is this stuff actually recorded with a real actual head mic? Or is it digitally reproduced? Or are you actually using sort of a combination of the two techniques to create this effect?
So both. For the voices, we use this. It's a mic from a company called Lumen. It's a German company. The KU100 is a super good microphone. But then a lot of content is crafted by us in the box with different tools that nowadays are incredible, and you can shape. And there is this plugin called DRVR, for example. You can shape movement. You can shape the width of a sound that before it was very complicated. A big sound has like volume, and translating this inside of a world on a video game is very complicated with one emitter. Right now we have things called like ambisonic, which has big spheres that you can rotate, and they can cover big distance and give you detail of different areas without having 250 emitters. You just put one, and then you like it's binaural and ambisonics and new techniques are very... binaural is not new at all. It's a very old technique, by the way. And then we went to record ambiances with the binaural head. And because there is... Although the digital created binaural sounds are good, they are not as good as the microphone one. And yet, every ear is different. I don't think we have a perfect solution for binaural sounds as powerful as how we hear, because what binaural recordings try to do is to capture the same way we hear. We hear perfectly in 3 dimensions, but every human is different, every ear is different, every head is different. And so normally these microphones are an average of a head. Like, I don't know how many tests they do, but it's not, for some people it doesn't work binaural audio at all. For our game specifically, I think the choice with the voices inside the head and is very natural, and I don't think of any other technology that can give us that effect, especially when we want the game on headphones, which is a very specific decision.
So how do you actually tailor the audio to sound good on like a home theater versus headphones? Because I do actually use like an Atmos setup myself, and I generally prefer to play games that way. But in this case, I actually did wind up using headphones to experience binaural at its best. But how do you actually tune the audio to work well in both cases?
It's a nightmare, really. I think we are a very small team. We took the decision of doing this game to sound the best on headphones. Although we did some adjustments to don't be... Because a binaural sound, when you transport it to speakers, and depending on the speakers, because there are multitude of them, they tend to sound much louder than in headphones. And this is a problem. So you need to do we did a quick mix to align more or less with what we think is a good place for them. But there are a different number of factors that we cannot control, and it will rely on a lot of time to make it work perfect. Hopefully one day we can achieve this, but right now we decided to put all our efforts in something that we can control, which is headphones. It's a very good question, and it's a very hard solution.
Another water detail I'm curious about is how all the shoreline rendering was done in the game, as well as any time in a cinematic, for example, when Senua interacts with water. How was that done?
So we actually used an awesome marketplace plugin called Fluid Flux, which it's got a load of different options. Like one of them is the shoreline rendering, but then it also does the real-time 2D fluid sims. So the scene where the lake drains, for example, that uses this fluid flux. So it's effectively a 2D real-time fluid sim, takes a height map capture of your area, and then you can basically inject or remove water, time, all that kind of stuff. And yeah, it's really awesome. We did kind of a lot of adjustments to it to get it to sort of work within our game. But it's a guy called Christian, like one guy made it, like amazing achievement. So yeah, you know, something other Unreal developers can sort of have a look at as well. But yeah, the shoreline, again, it does a kind of height map capture. You work out sort of where the shoreline bits are, and then you can sort of change parameters on wave speeds, wave heights, that kind of thing. And you can also make Niagara particle systems that read that same fluid data. So if there's debris of wood or whatever, it reacts to all the waves perfectly. And actually even audio used that. So we had little blueprints placed all along the shoreline. So we knew when the wave was coming in or going out, and that played the correct sound. So it's not just a random ocean sound. It actually is correct for where you're standing at that point.
It changed the materials of the floor. So when the water comes, it stops being sand. So you can play the perfect food. It's beautiful. The system works super well.
Yeah.
Speaking of effects there, I actually also wanted to ask, I have my video running here. So I wanted to ask you about one discrepancy between the gameplay reveal and the final game is the fire sequence in the Giant's Cave. If you notice in that original reveal trail, it's extremely smooth, extremely fluid, but compared to the final game, that's the one area where I felt like there was a little bit of a degradation in terms of visual quality. So I'm curious if you can sort of share why this effect in particular changed.
I ran out of memory. Actually, I can go a bit more in depth into that. So the original gameplay demo, basically I did a Houdini fire simulation, kind of baked it out, and we were streaming a frame per frame. Unfortunately, that way of doing it tanks your CPU. Like it just cannot stream it in quick enough and pass the data over to the GPU. So ended up having to do a version where I was kind of interpolating multiple flip books, like timed to sort of switch on and off, like in a sequence. It was honestly a bit of a headache getting that working. And it's one of the scenes I keep looking at going, like, but I've had a bit more time. I probably could have done something a bit better there. But you know, it's a learning process. And yeah, might make sort of different decisions next time around.
And see, that's the thing. For anyone watching the video, this type of answer is really important, right? To be able to talk about this stuff frankly. People always wonder, like, why is this different? Why does this change? What's the reason? But getting the direct, clear, logical answer as to why the choice was made, that's really, really important to help people better understand how game development sort of evolves over time for each project. The demo is obviously just a small little constrained thing, right? But doing everything at a larger scale, there's a lot more to consider. Another thing I wanted to talk about is you've done a lot of behind the scenes stuff, right? And that stuff is as good as I had hoped, right? During the cutscenes, the facial stuff is really, really good. But what I was surprised by was the quality of the facial expressions used during actual gameplay. So during that initial fight on the beach, for instance, you actually watch his facial expressions, the slaver. The quality of the facial expressions in game is something I don't really feel like we see often or even at all. And it really makes a difference. So I'm wondering if you can talk about that process, basically.
Yeah, I mean, that was actually quite a big moment for us as well, because we had a bunch of the cinematics in the game by that point, and we knew the three lateral face rigs with the sort of cubic motion processing the data, like that all looked great. And we didn't have a pipeline yet for how we do it in game, and Senua's face and Thorgust's face in that fight. So that was actually done. We used the MetaHuman animator pipeline. So, none of our faces in the game were MetaHuman creator faces. They're all very sort of custom. But we were able to use a mix of the head-mounted cameras and the iPhone technique, actually. So we could get the actors to go in, kind of watch bits of the gameplay, and actually recreate sort of all the facial expressions. And we found when we mapped it back on in game, we were like really surprised. We're like, oh, this is looking great, actually. So yeah, not having to rely on going to stage and doing a full head mount performance. Actually, we could put that stuff on afterwards is awesome. And yeah, like you said, like that fight really benefits from those interactions they have, and you see the expression on their face, and you can sort of tell the anger or taunting or whatever. So that MetaHuman animator pipeline was really good for us.
So you did mention photogrammetry, and I assume that applies to the individual mesh assets of the game, like a rock, for example, that you place in the level. But how did you generate and make the base level geometry, the terrain in the game? How was that done?
We obviously, each location is based on a real location. Maybe not, in the caves and stuff like that, obviously, and there's certain ones that we made bespoke. But what we started off with was we had DEM data for the whole of the Arctic Circle, actually, and then we had Iceland, which we cut out of that, and that was about I can't remember the resolution, something like 7 pixels per meter or something, which was all right, which kind of gave you a sort of ballpark kind of background sort of level. But then on the play space, what we did is we did drone-based photogrammetry. So we used a service called Drone Deploy, where we mapped out grid-based captures, and then we took that photogrammetry data, and then we generated height fields, which we post-processed in Houdini, and we did we stitched that into the overworld lower resolution DEM data as well, and then that was then exported out as height maps and brought into UE as the kind of base level. Wow. So that gave us basically the topography of the whole area. And then on top of that, obviously you start working into it for gameplay reasons kind of thing, but it gives you that kind of slate to work on. So it's kind of a three tier sort of approach. So, the bigger and then the slightly more higher resolution, then you're going down to the closer, minute details.
I think one of our things was we wanted the locations to feel believable. Yeah. So, they're not all exactly one-to-one, but you kind of believe they could be a real place. Yeah. I think that definitely helped with that.
That sounds like a really powerful system, and I imagine it could create a much more detailed shoreline, for example, than a different kind of more handmade system, at least one that's more realistic.
You do, and it takes a big chunk of work out. It's in the same way as with photogrammetry in a rock, doing it for a big sort of big wide brushstroke of the whole area, you're getting a very good base to work off. And like Mark says, you can't doing stuff like that by hand. Yeah, you could lay a kind of Google Maps down and kind of trace it out, but it's never going to have that same kind of level of nuance and interest and things like that.
Thinking of terrain, I really like the sequences where you would do a time jump, where the camera would be moving across the landscape, pointing up towards the clouds, and then swoop over through the clouds and coming right back down in a different portion of the map. So I'm wondering how this actually works within the editor and how it's set up. I assume you're doing some sort of data streaming in here, but it'd be great if you could sort of discuss how this actually works.
Smoke and mirrors.
Smoke and mirrors. So streaming, yeah. So we had a custom tool that allowed us to sort of load chunks of chapters in So you could sort of visualize everything you needed. But then for those transitions, we had to stream out and stream in the next sort of scenes we needed, which is tricky, right? Like, I mean, you've sort of pointed out in a lot of your videos, like garbage collection and unloading of assets, easily causes hitches, and that was one of the things we ran into like very quickly. So there was a lot of sort of code resource put on to, trying to mitigate that. How do we sort of chunk stuff up so that it doesn't start hitching? And but yeah, effectively, the hard drives in the new consoles are like so fast now that you can stream stuff in pretty quick. We actually had slow hard drive mode testing though, because obviously if you're on PC, like this was potentially an issue. And we actually found when we were doing run throughs, like on slower hard drives on PC, it's like, oh, that just hasn't loaded quick enough. And we needed to change the streaming volumes and that kind of thing. So it's, but yeah, it's the setting ourselves the challenge of having no cuts. Just makes our lives really, really hard. So, working out how to do those transitions, like going into clouds, that kind of stuff is obvious way. We had some load of ideas of other ways of doing it, but we might save that for another day.
So what was the impetus to make the PC version the way it is? It has a pretty interesting settings menu that splits up things and shows the preview for settings, which you don't see too often. So what inspired that design?
Yeah, I think like people in the team cared about that stuff. So there was an effort sort of put into sort of giving those options for PC, and actually, I think it's useful seeing, when you're toggling something from low to high, what difference is that making on my rig? Like, how much memory have I got left? Like, how's it affecting my GPU? There's definitely more we can do, but it's cool, that stuff, I think. But it requires resource to put into it. Like, it sort of doesn't naturally fall out of it at the end, so you have to actually plan that stuff.
So one thing I guess it's always interesting to talk about, the audience always likes to know, is about frame rate, right? So I can understand why you guys targeted 30 frames per second, going for sort of that cinematic look. That's what we hear. But I'm wondering, at any point during the development process, were you considering higher frame rates on consoles? Was 30 FPS always sort of the target? This isn't an especially fast, twitchy game, so it could be argued that a lower frame rate actually isn't a huge problem in terms of impacting gameplay. So basically, could you break it down for us?
I mean, from the start, like, we always intended it to be really cinematic, and we wanted to really push the characters and the lighting and everything as far as we could. And the reality is that does have some constraints. So I think pointing to something actually in your analysis of the game, we really pushed on having a super solid 30 rather than a really uneven 60, because actually having something even feels better than sometimes reaching high frame rates and we're still learning UE5. It's it's still relatively new to us, and so we'll keep learning, improving, seeing where we can sort of make cost savings, and but the kind of consistent base was a key target definitely for the console.
As you mentioned earlier, I'm curious if there was any specific moment you can think of in the game where you were fighting against production time, or where you realized that Unreal has certain characteristics that you had to work against, essentially. I'm just curious what some of the challenges were on the project.
Time is always an issue in game. I think every game developer in the world, like, time is always your biggest enemy. But I mean, like, from a technical point of view, like, the character rendering was a difficult one because there's no Nanite option for characters at the moment. And when we enabled virtual shadow maps, the biggest cost is the characters. Actually, all the environments and stuff render pretty quick into the virtual shadow maps, but non-nanite geometry is still very expensive in it. So actually, like, a lot of work went into making sort of LODs for characters and working out sort of, you know, do we turn the peach fuzz off on lower LODs, that kind of thing. Actually, I think people were joking. Actually, what our patch, like, we didn't have to patch that much, but one of the patch notes was like fixed peach fuzz on Senua, and it's like, oh great.
Okay, so one of the last things I want to talk about here is the use of Epic's TSR. So as we noted in our initial coverage, and you guys kind of confirmed to us before, Hellblade uses Epic's TSR for upsampling duties and anti-aliasing, essentially. But a lot of Unreal Engine 5 games these days are shipping using AMD's FSR2 instead, which can work okay from high enough input resolutions, but we often see, especially in consoles, sort of a low base resolution, and the result is very fizzly, noisy. It doesn't look great. So I'm kind of wondering then about the selection process that you guys kind of went through, because at some point you have to make the call that, okay, for console, we're doing this or that, right? Can you talk a little bit about the performance implications of using TSR versus FSR2 and why you essentially made the choice that you did?
I mean, a lot of it is just kind of comparing the options, right? You look at it and you just make a call on what's going to give you the best look. I mean, all the sort of temporal techniques, they always introduce a bit of artifacting, and it's making a call on what works best for your game. I think, you know, if you were making something that needed really sharp lines, like kind of something not as soft as a game like Hellblade, maybe other options work better. But for us, I think it works quite well. It kind of, you know, it works well in sort of smoothing out some of the potential sort of Lumen refresh things you might see. So I think that it's just a case of figuring out which one's best for your title and looking into all options. Obviously on PC, we give you a bunch more, you know, there's the NVIDIA ones and AMD ones, and figure out what works best on your system. But you've got to make a call on console.
I think it was the right call in this case, definitely. It looks good. But I think we are coming up here on the end, so we should probably let you guys go. But we both very much appreciate you coming to talk to us about the game. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thank you for inviting us to do this.
All right, and that's going to do it for this video. So hopefully you guys found this insightful and interesting and sort of a behind-the-scenes peek at what is one of the best-looking games we've seen in a long time. And yeah, if you did enjoy it, be sure to let us know, and we'll see you next time.